20 coworkers froze mid-breath. Coffee cups stopped halfway to lips. The conference room fell into the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Shelby stood there, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks, pointing straight at Cole with a trembling finger. "I love you, you idiot!" Her voice cracked through the room like breaking glass. Cole's hand went numb. The coffee he'd been holding slipped, splashing across the polished table. 4 years. 4 years she had placed a fresh cup on his desk every single morning. 4 years of late-night texts, asking if he got home safe. 4 years of remembering his daughter's birthday, when he himself forgot his own. And this man, this oblivious, broken, beautiful fool, never once understood why. But here's what no one in that room knew. Cole hadn't missed the signs because he was blind. He had missed them because he was terrified of what seeing them would cost him. The alarm clock read 5:30 when Cole Brennan opened his eyes, just as it had every morning for the past 4 years. The bedroom was still dark, the kind of darkness that feels heavier in winter, pressing against the windows like something waiting to get in. He lay there for a moment, listening to the silence of the house, the way it seemed to breathe around him in the early hours before dawn. There was a time when this hour had felt different, when the warmth beside him made the cold outside irrelevant, when the sound of soft breathing next to his pillow was the only alarm clock he needed. But that warmth had been gone for 1,460 days, and Cole had learned to count mornings the way prisoners count walls. Each sunrise was another tally mark scratched into the cell of his grief. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, and his feet found the cold hardwood floor, a familiar shock that pulled him fully awake. The house was quiet, except for the distant ticking of the kitchen clock, a sound that had become the heartbeat of their home after Janine's had stopped beating in that hospital room 4 years ago. Cole moved through the hallway with the practiced silence of a man who had learned not to wake a sleeping child, past the bathroom where a single pink toothbrush stood beside his blue one like a small soldier, waiting for its companion that would never return, past the closed door of Rosie's room where a nightlight glowed faintly beneath the gap. He paused there, pressing his palm flat against the wood, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing through the door. 9 years old. She had been 5 when she lost her mother, barely old enough to understand what death meant, young enough that her memories were already starting to fade, like photographs left too long in the sun. Sometimes she would ask Cole to tell her stories about Janine, and he would watch her face as she listened, watch the way she tried to hold on to something she could feel slipping away. The kitchen greeted him with the same stillness it always did. Countertops clean, dishes put away, everything in its place because Cole had learned that order was the only defense against the chaos that threatened to swallow him whole. He moved to the cabinet and reached for his coffee mug, the plain blue one he'd used for years, and his hand hesitated over the one beside it. Janine's mug. White ceramic with yellow sunflowers painted around the rim. A gift from Rosie on a Mother's Day that felt like a lifetime ago. He remembered that morning with the clarity of a wound that had never quite healed. Rosie bouncing on the bed at 6 a.m., too excited to wait, her small hands clutching the wrapped box. Janine's sleepy laugh as she sat up and pulled their daughter into her lap. The way her eyes had filled with tears as she unwrapped the gift and saw those painted sunflowers. She had held the mug against her chest and kissed Rosie's forehead and said, "I'll use this every single morning forever." Forever had lasted 3 more months. The mug still sat there on the shelf, a thin layer of dust coating its surface, untouched since the morning she'd drunk her last cup of coffee from it, kissed Cole goodbye at the door, and driven to work through a red light that a delivery truck ran at 50 miles per hour. Cole made his coffee in silence, the familiar ritual grounding him in the present moment. While the machine gurgled and hissed its morning song, he pulled eggs from the refrigerator and set a pan on the stove, the blue flame flickering to life beneath the cast iron that Janine had insisted on buying even though it was expensive, even though he'd said they didn't need it. She had been right, of course. She was usually right. Breakfast for Rosie. Scrambled eggs shaped into a star on her plate, the way Janine used to do it every single morning without fail. Cole had watched his wife perform this small magic 100 times without paying attention, taking for granted the way her hands moved, the love encoded in every gesture that he only recognized now that those hands were gone forever. Then suddenly she was gone, and he was standing in this kitchen at 5 in the morning, tears streaming down his face as he watched YouTube tutorials on how to make eggs look like stars because his daughter had cried for 3 days straight, had refused to eat anything, had asked over and over where Mommy was and why wasn't she coming home. He'd burned the first dozen attempts, scraping charred egg into the trash while his hands shook. But he'd learned. That was what fathers did. They learned, even when learning felt like bleeding out slowly onto the kitchen floor. Rosie appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:45, her hair a tangled mess of brown curls that made Cole's chest ache because it was Janine's hair, Janine's exact hair, wild and beautiful and impossible to tame no matter how many products or techniques he tried. Sometimes looking at his daughter felt like being haunted by a ghost he desperately wanted to see. Like Janine had left a piece of herself behind in this small body that had her eyes, her smile, her way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. Rosie climbed onto her chair at the kitchen table, her bare feet dangling above the floor, and watched him with those two observant eyes that missed nothing, that saw through every smile he forced and every laugh he faked. She had developed this ability to read him sometime in the year after Janine died, this uncanny sense of when he was pretending to be okay and when he was actually falling apart inside. Cole set the plate in front of her, star-shaped eggs, 2 strips of bacon arranged into a smile, a glass of orange juice with a crazy straw she'd picked out herself at the grocery store, and she looked up at him with an expression that made him feel like he was standing in front of a judge presiding over a case she had already decided. "Dad," she said, picking up her fork but not eating, spinning it between her small fingers. "Are you sad?" The question landed in Cole's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything. He forced a smile, the same smile he'd been forcing for 4 years, and reached over to ruffle her tangled curls. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" Rosie chewed her bottom lip, a habit she'd inherited from her mother that sometimes made Cole's breath catch in his throat. "Because you smile," she said slowly, carefully, like she was solving a puzzle she'd been working on for a long time. "But your eyes don't smile. They look like they're waiting for something bad to happen, like you're always scared." Cole's hand froze in her hair. He stared at his daughter, this tiny person who saw too much, understood too much, and he had absolutely no idea what to say. How do you explain grief to a child? How do you tell her that some mornings the weight of getting out of bed feels like pushing against a wall of water? How do you admit that you've been holding your breath for 4 years, waiting for the next phone call, the next tragedy, the next moment when everything you love gets ripped away without warning? "I'm fine, Rosie," he said finally, pulling his hand back and turning toward the counter so she couldn't see his face, couldn't see the tears he was fighting back. "Eat your breakfast. We don't want to be late for school." He heard her fork scrape against the plate behind him, the small sounds of her eating, and he stood there, facing the window, watching the sun begin to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Another day. Another morning he had survived. Another 24 hours stretched out before him, like a road he had to walk alone. After breakfast came the morning ritual he both dreaded and treasured, standing behind Rosie in the bathroom, brush in hand, trying to tame her wild curls into something resembling a ponytail. His fingers were clumsy despite 4 years of practice, and the results were never quite right. one side always slightly higher than the other, a few strands always escaping to frame her face in ways that looked messy rather than intentional. But Rosie never complained. She just sat on her little step stool and watched him in the mirror with those knowing eyes. And sometimes Cole wondered if she kept quiet about the imperfect ponytails, because she knew how hard he was trying, because she understood that this was his way of saying, "I love you," when the actual words got stuck somewhere between his heart and his throat. He had bought 17 different hair products in the first year after Janine died. He had watched hundreds of tutorial videos. He had even taken a class at the community center, sitting among mothers who looked at him with pity and admiration in equal measure. His ponytails were still crooked. His braids still fell apart by lunchtime. But every morning he tried. Cole pulled into the parking lot at Wexler and Associates at 8:45, his usual time, the same parking spot he'd claimed for nearly 5 years now. The building was a 3-story glass and steel structure that housed one of the most successful tech consulting firms in the city, and Cole had worked here since before Rosie was born. First as a senior developer writing code that made other people's dreams come true, then as a team lead after Janine died, when his boss had promoted him with a firm handshake and the unspoken understanding that he needed the distraction, needed something to fill the hours that used to be filled with her. He gathered his laptop bag from the passenger seat, checked his reflection in the rearview mirror to make sure he looked like a functioning adult, and walked toward the entrance. The elevator carried him to the 3rd floor, with its familiar hum and slight shudder, and when the doors opened, he turned left toward his cubicle without thinking, his feet following a path they had memorized years ago. But he stopped 3 steps from his desk, the way he stopped every morning, arrested by the same small miracle that had greeted him for 4 years. There, in the exact center of his workspace, sat a cup of coffee. Steam rose from its surface in lazy spirals, curling upward toward the fluorescent lights like prayers seeking heaven. Cole stared at it with a mixture of gratitude and confusion that had never quite resolved itself into understanding. Black coffee? No sugar, exactly the way he liked it, though he couldn't remember ever telling anyone at the office his coffee preferences. For 4 years, this cup had appeared on his desk every single morning without fail, on Mondays and Fridays, on holidays, and ordinary days, during snowstorms and heat waves, always hot, always perfect, always waiting for him like a small daily gift from an anonymous benefactor. He had asked the office assistant once, a young man named Trevor, who handled mail and supplies and the endless small tasks that kept an office running. Trevor had shrugged and said he had no idea where the coffee came from. Cole had asked around casually, not wanting to seem ungrateful or paranoid, bringing it up in conversations as if it were merely curious, rather than something that had begun to feel almost sacred. No one claimed responsibility. Eventually, he had stopped asking and simply accepted it as one of those unexplainable kindnesses that sometimes appear in life, like finding money on the sidewalk or catching every green light on the way to an important meeting. He told himself it didn't matter who left the coffee. He told himself he was grateful regardless. But some mornings, when he wrapped his hands around the warm cup and felt its heat seep into his perpetually cold fingers, he wondered, on his desk, propped against his monitor where he could see it every time he looked up from his work, sat a framed photograph. Rosie and Janine at the beach 2 summers before the accident, their faces pressed together, both of them laughing at something outside the frame that Cole no longer remembered. Rosie had her mother's eyes, her mother's hair, her mother's smile that crinkled at the corners when it was genuine. Looking at that photo was like looking through a window into a life that no longer existed, a version of himself who had been happy without knowing how rare and precious and fragile that happiness truly was. Cole took a sip of his perfect, mysterious coffee and turned toward his computer, ready to begin another day of pretending he was fine, while something inside him slowly died of loneliness. The morning meeting started at 9:30, the same time it started every Thursday. Cole settled into his usual chair near the back of the conference room, laptop open in front of him like a shield, coffee cup within easy reach. The room filled slowly with the familiar faces of his colleagues, developers and designers, project managers and quality assurance specialists, all of them shuffling in with their own cups and computers, the low murmur of conversation filling the space like white noise. Cole participated in these meetings the way he participated in everything these days, present but not entirely there, contributing when required, retreating into silence when possible. He had become skilled at occupation without engagement, at being in a room without truly being in it. It was a survival mechanism, a way of moving through the world without letting the world move through him. Shelby Mathis walked in at 9:28, exactly 2 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, because Shelby was the kind of person who believed that early was on time and on time was late. She was the project manager for their division, 35 years old, with auburn hair that caught the light in a way Cole had noticed, but refused to acknowledge even to himself. She moved with the particular confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Shoulders back, chin up, heels clicking against the floor, in a rhythm that commanded attention without demanding it. When she spoke, people listened, not because she raised her voice or threw her weight around, but because she had earned their respect through competence and genuine care. But there was something about the way Shelby looked at Cole. He had noticed it over the years, the way you notice a change in the weather or a subtle shift in the air before a storm. Her gaze lingered a little too long when they spoke, staying on his face for an extra beat after he finished talking. Her voice softened almost imperceptibly when she addressed him directly, dropping into a register that felt more intimate than professional. She laughed at things he said that weren't particularly funny and remembered details about his life that he didn't remember sharing. Rosie's favorite color, his coffee order, the anniversary of Janine's death that no one else in the office acknowledged. Cole had noticed all of this, cataloged it in some dusty corner of his mind, and then deliberately ignored it. Because noticing meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant he would have to do something about it. And doing something about it was impossible. He had made promises, to Janine in the hospital as she slipped away, to himself in the empty house afterward, to the ghost that still slept on the left side of his bed, in the space he couldn't bring himself to fill. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor at 6:15 that evening, and Cole walked toward the parking lot with his laptop bag over his shoulder and his mind already at home with Rosie, calculating what he would make for dinner and whether she had finished her homework, and if her cough from last week had finally cleared up. The winter air hit him like a wall of cold when he pushed through the front doors, biting at his exposed face and slipping through the gaps in his coat. He hunched his shoulders against it as he made his way across the parking lot, passing the same cars he passed every evening, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the darkening sky. His car was where he'd left it that morning, a sensible sedan with a back seat full of Rosie's things, a forgotten sweatshirt from soccer practice, a library book due next week, a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers that she insisted on bringing everywhere, even though she was technically too old for stuffed animals. Cole unlocked the door and slid behind the wheel, putting his key in the ignition with the automatic motion of 1,000 previous departures. He turned the key. Nothing happened. He tried again, pressing harder as if force could solve mechanical failure. Nothing. The engine made a weak clicking sound, like it was trying to turn over, but couldn't quite manage the effort, and then fell silent with a finality that felt almost personal. Cole sat there in the cold car, staring at the dashboard, feeling the particular frustration of a man who did not need one more thing to go wrong today. He tried again, more out of stubbornness than hope, and was rewarded with the same pathetic clicking. Dead battery. It had to be. He sighed and reached for his phone, already calculating how long a tow truck would take, how much it would cost, how he would get to Rosie's after-school program before it closed at 7. A knock on his window made him jump, his heart hammering against his ribs for one wild moment. He turned to see Shelby standing beside his car, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air, her wool coat pulled tight around her shoulders, her auburn hair catching the light from the parking lot lamps. She was smiling, but it was a gentle smile, concerned, the kind of smile you give someone you've been watching struggle from a distance. Cole rolled down the window, or tried to, since the power windows were as dead as everything else, and settled for opening the door instead, the cold air rushing in to replace what little warmth remained. "Car trouble?" Shelby asked, and there was something in her voice, something almost hopeful, that Cole didn't let himself examine too closely. He nodded, running a hand through his hair in the gesture of frustration he'd developed over years of things going wrong. "Battery's dead. I'm going to have to call a tow." Shelby shook her head, a decisive motion. "Don't be ridiculous. I'll give you a ride home. You can deal with the car tomorrow." Cole opened his mouth to refuse, to say something about not wanting to impose, about calling a cab, about handling his own problems because that was what he did, what he had always done, what he would always do because relying on other people meant letting them get close, and letting them get close meant eventually losing them, and he could not survive losing anyone else. But Shelby was already walking toward her car, a silver SUV parked 2 rows over, and she called over her shoulder without looking back. "Come on, Cole. It's freezing out here, and Rosie is waiting for you." The mention of his daughter, so casual and knowing, stopped whatever protest he had been forming. He sat there for a moment, watching Shelby walk away, her heels clicking against the pavement with that confident rhythm, and then he grabbed his bag and followed. Because what else was he supposed to do? He climbed into the passenger seat of Shelby's car and immediately noticed how warm it was, how it smelled like her perfume, something light and floral that made him think of spring afternoons, of gardens and sunshine and things growing toward the light. There was a photo of a golden retriever stuck to the dashboard, slightly crooked, and a pair of sunglasses in the cup holder, and a half-empty water bottle in the door pocket. Signs of a life being lived, of a person being present in their own existence. Shelby slid in beside him and turned down the radio that had been playing softly, some pop song he didn't recognize, and glanced at him as she put the car in drive. "Where to?" Cole gave her his address and leaned back against the seat, watching the parking lot slide past as they pulled onto the main road. The city was lit up in the early evening darkness, streetlights and shop windows, and the headlights of other cars all blurring together into streams of light that painted the windows like something out of a dream. They drove in silence for a few minutes, and Cole was acutely aware of how small the space was, how close Shelby was sitting, how he could reach out and touch her if he wanted to. Shelby spoke first, breaking the silence with a gentleness that felt deliberate. "How's Rosie?" The question surprised him, though it shouldn't have. She always asked about Rosie, always remembered to ask, which was more than most people did. "She's good," Cole said carefully, staring out the window at the passing lights. 3rd grade now, reading above her level, really into dinosaurs at the moment. She wants to be a paleontologist when she grows up, which is apparently very different from wanting to be an archaeologist, and she will correct you very firmly if you mix them up. Shelby laughed, and the sound filled the car like something warm and unexpected, like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Dinosaurs are cool. I went through a dinosaur phase when I was her age. Drove my parents absolutely crazy, asking for all these books and toys and posters. My room looked like a natural history museum exploded in it." Cole found himself smiling despite himself, despite the walls he kept up, despite everything. "Rosie's more of a Triceratops girl. Says they're the tough ones because they could defend themselves. She has very strong opinions about which dinosaurs would win in a fight." Shelby laughed again, shaking her head. "Smart kid. Triceratops could absolutely take a T-Rex any day. Those horns weren't just for decoration. They fell back into silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Easier, less weighted, like they had crossed some invisible threshold into a space where quiet didn't have to mean uncomfortable. Shelby pulled into his driveway 15 minutes later, the headlights illuminating the front of his house. A modest 2-story in a modest neighborhood. The kind of house young couples bought when they were starting families, expecting to fill it with children and noise and life. Cole had bought it with Janine when they found out she was pregnant with Rosie, both of them so excited and terrified, and sure that this was the beginning of everything they'd ever wanted. It was supposed to be a beginning. Instead, it had become a memorial, a museum of a life that had stopped existing while the building remained standing. Cole reached for the door handle, already composing the polite thank you he would offer, already preparing to retreat into the safety of his solitary life. But Shelby spoke before he could escape, her voice soft in the darkness of the car. "Cole," she said, and something in the way she said his name made him stop, made him turn back to look at her. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something sad and hopeful and terribly vulnerable all at once, like she was standing on the edge of something she wasn't sure she should jump from. "If you ever need to talk," she said carefully, each word chosen with precision, "about anything at all, work or life or anything, I'm here. I want you to know that." He met her eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, he let himself see what was there. The concern that went beyond professional courtesy, the care that felt personal and warm, the something more that she wasn't saying, but that hung in the air between them like an unfinished sentence waiting for its ending. And then he looked away, pulled back into himself, closed the door he had accidentally left open. "Thanks for the ride, Shelby," he said, his voice perfectly professional, perfectly distant. "I appreciate it." He got out of the car before she could say anything else, walked up his driveway without looking back, and didn't let himself breathe until he heard her car pulling away into the night. The weeks that followed were a slow torture that Cole didn't fully understand. Shelby began appearing in his orbit with increasing frequency, always with a reasonable excuse, always with a smile that seemed meant just for him. She assigned him to a project that required late nights at the office, complex work that needed his expertise, and she stayed late too, always there when he looked up from his screen, ordering pizza to the conference room where they worked side by side, their laptops and papers spread across the long table like offerings on an altar. She remembered that Rosie's birthday was coming up. He didn't remember telling her, but she knew somehow, the way she seemed to know everything about him. And she handed him a small gift one morning, a stuffed bear the color of lavender, because she knew that was Rosie's favorite color. The card attached read, "For the special little girl of a very special man." Cole stared at those words for a long time after Shelby walked away, turning them over in his mind like stones, trying to convince himself they meant something other than what they obviously meant. His coworker Derek cornered him in the break room one afternoon, a cup of terrible office coffee in one hand and a look of amused disbelief on his face. Derek was the kind of guy who said what everyone else was thinking, the office truth teller who got away with it because he was genuinely likable beneath all his bluntness. He leaned against the counter and watched Cole pour himself a cup of the bitter brew, shaking his head slowly, like he was witnessing something tragic. "So," Derek said casually, "are you actually blind? Or are you just pretending to be?" Cole looked up, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" Derek laughed, a short burst of sound that echoed off the break room walls. "Shelby, man. Shelby Mathis. The woman who runs our entire department, who could have any guy she wanted, who walks around this office looking at you like you hung the moon and personally arranged all the stars around it. That's Shelby. Are you seriously telling me you haven't noticed?" Cole felt his face heat despite himself, blood rushing to his cheeks like a teenager caught with a crush. "She's my boss," he said flatly, automatically. "She's professional. She treats everyone well." Derek stared at him for a long moment, and then he laughed again, harder this time. The kind of laugh that comes from witnessing something so absurd you can't quite believe it's real. "Brother," Derek said, clapping Cole on the shoulder as he walked past. "She does not look at everyone the way she looks at you. She does not stay late working with everyone. She does not remember everyone's kid's birthday. Wake up." He left Cole standing there with his terrible coffee and his racing heart, and a truth he wasn't ready to face. That night, Cole came home to find Rosie sitting at the kitchen table, drawing pictures with her crayons, tongue sticking out slightly in concentration, the way it always did when she was focused. He sat down across from her, still thinking about what Derek had said, and Rosie looked up at him with those two observant eyes. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Cole nodded, bracing himself the way he always braced himself for Rosie's questions, because, with his daughter, questions could go anywhere. She chewed her bottom lip, considering her words carefully. "Is Shelby your friend?" Cole blinked, surprised. "How do you know about Shelby?" Rosie shrugged, still drawing, not looking up. "She came to the house that one time with your papers. You forgot. I liked her. She had nice eyes, and she asked me about my dinosaurs, and she actually listened when I told her about how velociraptors probably had feathers." Cole remembered that day with sudden clarity. Shelby had shown up on a Saturday morning with documents he'd left at the office, documents that could have waited until Monday, but that she insisted he needed right away. She had stood in his doorway and talked to Rosie for almost 20 minutes while Cole gathered his things, and Rosie had laughed at something she said, really laughed, the kind of bright, unself-conscious laugh Cole hadn't heard from his daughter in a long time. Rosie was still watching him, waiting for an answer. She's my boss," Cole said finally, the words feeling inadequate. "We work together." Rosie tilted her head, considering this the way she considered everything, with that serious focus that made her seem older than 9. "But she looks at you like Mom used to look at you." The words hit Cole like a physical blow, like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. He stared at his daughter, at her mother's eyes in her mother's face, and couldn't speak. Rosie continued, oblivious to the earthquake she had just caused. "In the video, the wedding video, Mom looks at you like that, all soft and shiny, like you're the only person in the whole room. Shelby looked at you that way when she was here. I noticed." Cole stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Finish your drawing, Rosie," he said, and his voice sounded strange even to himself. "I'm going to start dinner." He walked to the kitchen and stood at the counter, his hands gripping the edge so hard his knuckles turned white. That night, after Rosie was asleep, he found himself sitting in front of the television, the wedding video playing on the screen. He watched Janine walk down the aisle toward him, watched her face, watched her eyes. And he saw what Rosie had seen. That look, that soft, shining look of someone so in love they couldn't hide it even if they tried. His chest ached with grief, with longing, with the terrible weight of loving someone who was gone forever. And somewhere, in the part of his mind he refused to acknowledge, he wondered if Rosie was right about Shelby. The following months brought a new complication in the form of Preston Hale. He arrived from the Chicago branch in April, a transfer that came with impressive credentials and an even more impressive sense of his own importance. He was tall and handsome in a conventional way, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from a life where things have always gone according to plan. He smiled constantly, told jokes that weren't quite as funny as he thought they were, and seemed to believe that charm was an adequate substitute for substance. Cole disliked him immediately, though he told himself it was purely professional. Preston was assigned to work with Shelby on a major client project, and suddenly he was everywhere she was, pulling out chairs for her in meetings, bringing her coffee from the good place down the street, complimenting her presentations with an enthusiasm that bordered on theatrical. Cole watched from his usual seat in the back of conference rooms, telling himself he didn't care, telling himself it wasn't his business, telling himself the tight feeling in his chest every time Preston leaned too close to Shelby was indigestion and absolutely nothing more. But he noticed things he didn't want to notice. He noticed that Shelby accepted Preston's compliments with polite but distant smiles that never quite reached her eyes. He noticed that her gaze still sought his across crowded rooms, even when Preston was standing right beside her. He noticed that the coffee still appeared on his desk every morning, still perfect, still hot, still waiting. And he noticed, against his will, against his better judgment, that Preston's presence made him feel something uncomfortably close to jealousy. One Monday morning, Preston appeared in the office carrying a bouquet of roses, so large he could barely see over them. He walked directly to Shelby's desk and presented them with a flourish, loud enough for half the floor to hear. For the most brilliant project manager in the company. There was a smattering of awkward applause from nearby coworkers who didn't know what else to do. Shelby thanked him politely and set the flowers aside, and then her eyes scanned the room until they found Cole. She held his gaze for a long moment, and there was something in her expression, a question, an invitation, a plea, that he pretended not to understand. He looked back at his computer screen and kept typing, his fingers hitting the keys harder than necessary. But something was changing, something he couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried. Shelby stopped leaving coffee on his desk. The morning after Preston's dinner invitation, Cole arrived at work to find his desk empty, no steaming cup waiting for him, and the absence felt like a hole in the center of his day, like something essential had been removed while he wasn't looking. Her text messages stopped too, those late-night check-ins asking if he'd gotten home safely, the casual questions about Rosie, the links to articles she thought he might find interesting. She still spoke to him in meetings, still worked with him on projects, but there was a distance now, a coolness, a professional barrier that hadn't been there before. She was pulling away. She was giving up, and Cole, who should have felt relieved, instead felt like he was watching something precious slip through his fingers while his hands refused to close. The worst part was the elevator. They found themselves alone together one Thursday afternoon, the doors closing on an empty car, the silence between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Shelby stood on one side, Cole on the other, and neither of them spoke. The elevator hummed and rose, floor by floor, and Cole was acutely aware of her presence, the scent of her perfume, the sound of her breathing, the tension radiating from her shoulders. Halfway to their floor, the elevator jerked slightly, and Shelby stumbled. Cole's hand shot out instinctively, catching her arm, steadying her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time stopped. She was so close, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her blue eyes, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her skin through her sleeve, close enough that he could have kissed her if he'd had the courage. Shelby's breath caught audibly. Her hand came up to rest on his, the lightest touch, barely there but burning. And then she pulled away, stepped back, looked at the floor. The elevator dinged. The doors opened. She walked out without looking back, and Cole stood there with his hand still raised, feeling the ghost of her touch, hating himself for wanting more. Rosie got sick in late May, a fever that spiked to 103 in the middle of the night, a cough that wouldn't stop no matter what medicine Cole gave her, a little girl who lay on the couch wrapped in blankets looking smaller and more fragile than he could bear. He called in to work and explained the situation to Shelby's voicemail, his voice tight with worry. And then he spent the next 3 days hovering over his daughter like a guardian angel with no idea what he was doing. The doctor said it was just the flu, that she would be fine with rest and fluids, but Cole couldn't shake the cold terror that gripped him every time he looked at her flushed face. Losing Janine had taught him how quickly everything could change, how a normal day could become the worst day of your life in the space of a phone call. He couldn't lose Rosie. He wouldn't survive it. On the second day, the doorbell rang. Cole opened it to find a delivery driver holding a paper bag, the kind restaurants use for takeout orders. "Delivery for Brennan," the driver said, and Cole nodded, confused, taking the bag automatically. He hadn't ordered anything. Inside the bag was a container of chicken soup, still warm, the good kind from the deli downtown that cost too much, but tasted like someone's grandmother had made it with love. There was also a bottle of children's fever reducer, a package of tissues, and tucked at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a small stuffed bear. Purple. The same color as the one Shelby had given Rosie for her birthday. There was no card, no note, no name anywhere to indicate who had sent it. Cole stood in his kitchen, holding the purple bear, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. Rosie was asleep on the couch, but she woke when Cole sat down beside her, and she reached for the bear with weak hands, a small smile breaking through her feverish discomfort. She held it against her chest and whispered, "It's purple, like my other bear, like the one Shelby gave me." Cole stared at the bear, then at his daughter, then at the bag of supplies sitting on the coffee table. And finally, something shifted in the locked room of his heart. The quarterly review meeting was scheduled for June 15th, a Thursday, at 2 o'clock in the large conference room. Cole arrived 10 minutes early and took his usual seat near the back. The room filled gradually with coworkers, the hum of conversation, the rustle of papers. Shelby stood at the front organizing her notes, and she didn't look at him. She hadn't really looked at him in weeks. Preston arrived 5 minutes late, making an entrance as always, flashing his too-white smile. The meeting proceeded normally for 2 hours. Then Preston stood up. "Before we all head out, I have a little announcement." He turned to Shelby, his smile widening. "Shelby, I've been trying to be patient, but I think we both know where this is going." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box, and the room felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of it. "I made reservations at that French place you love, and I got you a little something. What do you say? Dinner tonight?" The room was silent. 20 faces watched. Shelby's face had gone pale. She wasn't looking at Preston. She was looking across the room at Cole, her eyes filled with desperation and hope. Say something. Do something. Please. Cole's heart hammered against his ribs. He should stand up. He should say something. But 4 years of fear had frozen him solid. He looked down at his laptop and pretended to read something. Shelby stood so fast, her chair crashed over behind her. 4 years, she said, and her voice cracked on the words. 4 years, Cole. She stepped toward him, tears streaming down her face. 4 years I've been leaving coffee on your desk. Black. No sugar. The way you like it. Did you ever once wonder who was leaving it? 4 years of late-night texts to make sure you got home safe. 4 years of remembering Rosie's birthday when you couldn't even remember your own. And you never once looked at me and saw what was right in front of your face. She was standing before him now, close enough to touch, tears and fury and love all tangled together on her face. I love you, you idiot. I have loved you since the day you walked into this office with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. I have loved you through your grief and your silence and your stubborn refusal to let anyone in. 4 years I told myself to be patient. But you weren't healing, Cole. You were hiding. And I can't do this anymore. I can't keep loving someone who refuses to be loved. She turned and walked toward the door. Cole watched her hand reach for the handle, and somewhere inside him, something finally broke. He heard Janine's voice, clear as if she were standing beside him. Live, Cole. I need you to live. He ran after her, found her in the stairwell, shoulders shaking. Shelby. Go away, Cole. I knew, he said, his voice rough. Part of me knew. The coffee, the texts, all of it. I knew. She turned around, face streaked with tears. Then why? Because I was scared. The night Janine died, I promised myself I would never love anyone again. If I loved someone and lost them, I wouldn't survive it. Rosie wouldn't survive it. So I closed everything off. So you chose not to live at all? Her voice softened. You think Janine wanted this? She loved you. She wanted you to be happy. Cole remembered Janine's final words, her hand squeezing his in the hospital. Promise me. Don't let Rosie grow up thinking her father doesn't know how to be happy. Teach her how to love, Cole, by letting her see you be loved. He took Shelby's hand, the first time he had voluntarily touched anyone in 4 years. I've been an idiot, a blind, stubborn, terrified idiot. But I see you now, Shelby. I see everything. And I want to try. I want to let you in. When she wrapped her arms around him, he held her back, really held her, and felt something other than grief for the first time in 4 years. That night, Cole drove home with lightness in his chest. Rosie looked up from her homework. Dad, you look different. He sat down. Rosie, what would you think if Shelby came for dinner this weekend? Rosie's eyes went wide. Then she grinned. Finally. I thought you were going to be dumb about it forever. Cole started laughing, really laughing, and Rosie laughed too, and the kitchen felt warmer than it had in years. The following Monday, Cole reached for the mug beside his usual one, Janine's sunflower mug. He wiped the dust off, poured coffee into it. Not to replace Janine, but to continue, to live. By the time Rosie came downstairs, there were 3 plates on the table. She smiled without saying anything. The doorbell rang at 7:15. Shelby stood there with donuts and nervous hope. I brought breakfast. Come in, Cole said, stepping aside. Rosie grabbed Shelby's hand. Do you know how to braid hair? Dad's really bad at it. Shelby laughed. I make excellent princess braids. Cole stood watching them go, his daughter leading this woman into their lives. On the shelf, Janine's photo smiled at him. For the first time, looking at her didn't feel like drowning. It felt like permission. The kitchen filled with Rosie's chatter and Shelby's gentle instructions. Cole poured coffee into 3 mugs, his blue one, a white one for Shelby, and the sunflower mug that no longer gathered dust. Shelby looked up when he set it beside her, understanding what it meant. She covered his hand with hers. Thank you, she said quietly. Rosie looked at them in the mirror. Dad, your eyes are doing it. Doing what? Smiling. Your eyes are smiling now. Through the kitchen window, morning sunlight poured in, illuminating the 3 of them. Janine's photo watched over them, a blessing and a goodbye. And in that kitchen, surrounded by coffee and laughter, a broken family began to become whole again. Not by forgetting what they had lost, but by finding the courage to love what they had found. The sunflower mug was no longer gathering dust. It was full of coffee, full of hope, full of a future Cole had finally stopped being afraid to want.